into the and that book came out before Sailing
Yeah.
to the Disaster, and it delves into the life of visionary architect Woody Garber as he and his family build a house of glass.
Mhm.
And there's more to it than that, but we encourage you to ask. I have pages of questions for Elizabeth. We encourage you to ask questions. And I guess what would happen is that you unmute yourselves and just go like that, right, Joe? Yeah, okay. So, Elizabeth, could you please give us an overview, a summary of your book, and then to grab their attention, read the prologue.
Prologue. So when I was 17 and my younger brother was 14, my dad happened to read an article from the New York Times about an alternative high school on a sailing ship, a square rig sailing ship. And not only did he think this was a great idea, but he called the director. He made arrangements with her, and he came home and announced at the dinner table that he was sending us off to get interviewed, but his intention was that he was sending us to sea. I was about to graduate from high school. I wanted to go to college. I had never, ever thought of being on a sailing ship. In fact, I had only seen the ocean once before. But my younger brother had always dreamed of going to sea. But he was my father's so-called problem child. But then my dad announced that we were both his problem children, and that he thought sending us to this school at sea was the answer to his problem children. But it ended up being the crazy adventure of a lifetime. So fortunately, I kept a journal, and I wrote sometimes 10 pages a day. So I wrote about the year of us going to the square rig sailing ship, working on it. It was not ready to sail. It took 3 months before we limped out of Miami Harbor and sort of slowly made a miraculous recovery. That the ship even sailed is miraculous. That nobody died is really miraculous. And that the ship didn't sink is quite remarkable. But one of my classmates, because we were all teenagers at the time, he said, "Why did you call it Sailing at the Edge of Disaster?" I don't remember anything being dangerous or disaster. I said, "We were teenagers. We thought we were immortal." But it was, if you read the book, you'll remember how unbelievably dangerous it was, and that it was at the edge of disaster. So one of the things you need to know about this ship, and I had this wonderful young man do a watercolor of the ship. 365 feet long. It had been built in the 1930s for Marjorie Merriweather Post as a sailing yacht. So it had 7 staterooms. Each one had different patterns of marble and gold fixtures, and some had fireplaces. And there were these 7 luxury staterooms. And then there was room for 70 crew member, which were needed to sail this ship. The masts went up, the highest mast went up about 130 feet. The second low was about 100 feet above the deck. So when we got on the ship, we had been told, the school had been told when they leased the ship, that the ship would be ready to sail in 2 weeks. And it took 4 months. And the director of the school ended up fundraising $400,000, which is the equivalent of $250,000 now, to get the ship ready to sail. But she was persistent and naive. She was only 24. None of us knew that. She was just this visionary who had these wild ideas, and she was just determined. And we kids, there were 45 boys and 6 girls, and 10 teachers, most of whom were in their 20s, just out of college. And then we would get crew members on, the crew would leave, new crew would come, we would have officers come and then leave, because no one wants to be on a disastrous sailing ship. But eventually we made it to Panama. So anyway, part of being on a sailing ship was that all the kids. We were there to be students, but then we discovered they canceled all the classes and that we got to work, and we worked 8 to 10 hour days almost every day. We sometimes had Sundays off, and we ended up re-rigging the whole ship and redoing the woodwork on the ship and doing outrageous, amazing work. But one of the things we had to do is everyone had to climb up in the rigging. So I'm going to read this prologue. One of the things when you're writing a memoir, you're going, all right, what's the most compelling moment that's going to grab people that you'll put in a prologue? And you go, maybe this one, and maybe this one. And you sort of go back and forth the whole time you're writing the book. And then you finally decide what piece you're going to put for the prologue. So this is fall 1971 in the rigging. So what you need to know is I have a terrible fear of heights. I can't. My legs wobble on the rope rung, digging into my sneakers. I hold on to the cables running up along the mast over 100 feet above the ship's deck. I close my eyes for a second, but that makes everything worse. My chest thuds, my body trembles. I try to speak up. Me, the pitiful teenager frozen in the rigging. I can't do this. I don't care how pathetic I sound. The crewman on the second platform above me leans over the edge and gives directions. Reach up one hand over your head to seize hold of these shrouds, and hold up the other hand. Pull yourself up and over the platform. His voice is upbeat. You can do it. My hands are sweating. My knees threaten to give way, and he sounds so fucking positive. All the way up this rope ladder, I faced the steel mast and chanted, I can do it, like some ridiculous little engine that could. And I'm okay until I get here. I'm on the main mast of our school's 4-masted square rigger for sail training. Everyone is required to climb up and over the second platform in the rigging. I'm supposed to lean my whole body out at a 90-degree angle over a wide open empty space. What if my arms let go? There's nothing underneath me to catch me. The mast moves, a slow, sickening sway. I glance down at the docks, the boatyards, the causeway to Miami when nausea catches in my throat. Dad's voice slams into me like a loudspeaker turned on in my brain. You're weak. You've never learned to work. My hands shake and my grip starts to slip. His voice tears into me, pummeling, his words a 1-2 punch before he knocks me with a hook. You'll never amount to anything. I tremble, barely hanging on. I close my eyes. My head slumps against the rope rungs. Coming to the ship was my escape, but Dad knows exactly how to break me. I don't know how to hold him at bay here. My arms are weakening. I just can't do it. So that's where it starts.
And obviously she did it because
I
she's
survived.
here to tell the tale. So we have some newcomers to the group, and as I said, I have several questions, but if you have questions, let us know. My first group of questions are about the experience of writing a memoir. How do you remember all the details? And tell us more about your journal that you
Journal. So I started keeping a journal probably when I was about 10 or 11. It was like the beginning of summer vacation, school's out, that kind of I remember my best friend and I camping out in a tent in the backyard and playing crazy eights, that kind of thing. And I would keep it up for a few days and then I would forget it. But every year the journal got longer. So by the time I went to the ship, I had this big empty book and I just started writing like crazy. And it was how I defined myself. And I was the kid who was always writing in her journal. And then my best friend, who I was sharing a room with, she also kept a journal. So hers was bright color pens and big handwriting all over. And mine was careful, beautiful handwriting and sort of talking about what was going on and what I was feeling. And I felt like I had this commitment to myself to write, but I also felt like I needed to write everything down that I noticed and what was going on. And I feel like that process of having done all that writing while I was there helped anchor a lot of it in my memory. Where when I started writing the book and started having the idea of it, I searched down as many of the people I knew from the ship or could remember from the ship. And I had the list of everybody's names and where they had come from in 1971. So it was a real fun scavenger hunt for months trying to find people. And then more people kept showing up or finding us. And I also started a private Facebook group where whenever I'd find someone, they'd come on, they would post photos that they had. So we started creating this repository of all these photos from our year on the ship. And the book has a big section of photos in the middle, black and white photos, 60s photos, 70s photos. So photos are a great way to help charge up memory and remember things, but also having these conversations with each other. I'd say, okay, now, when exactly did we do, when did the Norwegian team or when did the Danish first mate come on and get us swabbing the decks with salt water? And then some people remembered the words of the Danish songs that we sang while we were swabbing the decks. And someone else remembered the song he played on the piano that right before he left. And so I would just start, it would spark all of our memories and people would just start putting in more pieces. But because I was both taking photographs and I was writing in my journal and I'm very visual, I just had this incredible visual memory and also memory of interactions with people. When I was working on writing the memoir, one of the decisions when you're writing a memoir is, do you write it as, at that point I was in my 60s, do I write it as an adult looking back, talking about and describing what I was like then? Or Susan Conley's suggestion was, get into the voice of being a teenager. And when you get that voice, it's just going to start going. So I'll just read the first couple of sentences that show that teenager voice. Dad had some idiot plan to send me to Catherine Gibbs Secretarial School in New York City so I could work my way through college. Sylvia Plath even mentioned that school in the bell jar as the destination for those perfectly made up 50s girls and twin sets and pearl necklaces. Oh God, I would die there. So when I got that voice, I was like totally into my 17-year-old self. It was just, I could just write. I could remember what I thought at 17. Like I remember getting on the ship and walking with a group of girls and we were going down to the mess the first day. And I remember going, all right, did they shave their legs? Are they wearing a bra? It was like all those things that you were constantly thinking about, you know, the priorities of life, you know, shaving and bras. It was like, and how were they dressed? And like all that inner commentary, it just came zooming back. So that really helped, because once I was in that voice and that way of looking at things, I remembered how we talked to each other. I remembered expressions that we would use. And then it was in this wonderful collaboration with my classmates. And they're remembering things. And then so I feel like one of the things that I've discovered about writing memoir is we live our life. And then when we have a chance when we're older, and you need to be older to write a memoir because part of it is reflection and thinking back. And it's like, it's 20-year-olds write memoirs, but they're not like a 6-year-old writing a memoir, and that reflection on what it was like living in the early 70s and what was going on, and that interplay of thoughtful, compassionate understanding. And I realized when you're a 17-year-old or a teenager living through something, you don't have a clue of half of what's going on because you're so in your own little world. So I feel like going back to it and going back to all those memories and going back to those conversations with my classmates, I got to not only relive the year on the ship, I also got to learn all these things that I totally missed. And I was worried about my journal, and I was worried about, was I depressed? And I was worried about all these things. And I didn't really learn that well about the rigging. And I didn't really learn, I was really good at doing the knot work and when we were re-rigging the ship, but I got to go back and learn how to do it again as an adult. And I felt like there were all these things that I learned that I'd missed out on. And some of my classmates said, I wish I had known all of you now rather than back then, because so many of us were shy or awkward or sarcastic or all those things. And that in a way we got a chance to become friends again and reconnect. And it had such a sense of camaraderie, um, and sort of putting in questions and connecting with each other. And some of us got together who were, people on the ship were all over the world right now. But that it was like cousins. We stepped right back in. And the people who had been really close friends were the ones that I were the most likely to be found. And we just had a blast putting all these pieces together. And we discovered and got to try to understand things that we hadn't understood back then. And some of them were really mysterious, strange things. Like there's a book about the sea cloud and a history of the sea cloud that because the sea cloud is it's a luxury sailing yacht, and you can go sailing on it now. It sails in the Mediterranean in the summer and the Caribbean in the winter. And people, when I was working on the book, said, "Oh, are you going to go back to it?" I went, "No, it's too expensive. I can't do that." But then I thought, maybe I do. Maybe I do need to go. So I figured out, I looked up on their website and I went, all right, what's the absolute cheapest journey? And they had 4 days of sailing around the Canary Islands and stopping at different islands. But I thought, okay, 4 days. We had to fly to Portugal and then fly to the Canaries, but it was a really great time. It was right before COVID. But I'm so glad, because there's so much of that physicality of being on a ship and walking on the deck and the feel of it when you're in seas, and how it feels where you're sort of wandering down the deck and it's hard to get your balance. And then when you get your balance, and then when you walk off the ship and suddenly you've got land legs and it's so odd. And I got to ask lots of questions and put pieces together. And then one of the officers took us in all the secret down below decks places that I had never gone before, but turns out my little brother had gotten to most of those places because he was one of the bad boys, right? But oh, speaking of my younger brother, who ended up, so he was 14, 15 that year. He ended up going to becoming a merchant mariner, going to Merchant Marine Academy out of high school, and worked at sea and was in the engine room and worked his way up to chief engineers, and worked on really huge ships, and did a lot of going through pirate waters, and it really wore him out. Working at sea is a really tough way to make a living. But he came out of the ship and he so admired all these officers that he eventually found people who really knew how to sail a ship, and he became someone that he could really admire and appreciate. But when my brother would look back and I would interview him and ask him about what it was like for him being on the ship, he said, "Oh, I was just a stupid little shit. And he didn't see how remarkable he was. And a number of people, after they've read the book, said, your brother was really one of the heroes of the ship. And that was something that was really important for me to hold up a mirror to show how remarkable he was. He got in a lot of trouble because he was a truth speaker. He said the real thing of, this ship is a disaster. The ship is in terrible shape. Well, the director of the school wanted to send him home because he wasn't upbeat and positive, and where he was just talking about what was real. At the end, she finally realized he was quite remarkable. But my brother struggled with self-esteem and depression, but he saved us a number of times, and he was really something. And he was really proud of the book. And he goes, well, it's not very often that you really get to be a major character in a book that your sister wrote. So it was very cute in a bashful sort of way. And my friend Alvin, who's on this call, knew my brother and me when we were teenagers.
Ah, and okay.
Yes.
I'll just keep on with my questions here.
Time of questions, and I'll meander.
Yeah, I love it. It's great. Did you ever have any memories that surprised you that, like, I didn't remember that happened
Yes.
through the writing process?
Oh, through the writing process. Well, one of the most, one of the things what I'll let you all know is we ended up being held captive. The ship was held hostage in Panama, and there were two armed gunboats with machine guns uncovered on the bow, and they were keeping us from getting away. And they essentially, we didn't have food and water, and they starved us off the ship. But I was reading in the history of the book about our year at sea, and the captain had been interviewed 10 to 15 years later, and he said, oh, it's when they shot at us. And I remember going to the group of people on the group and saying, it says we were shot at. We were never shot at. He was just making things up. And a number of people said, oh, no, no. And then my two best friends on the ship, Pogo, said, oh, yeah, they shot at us. I was in the bowsprit net the morning at dawn when the PT boat shot over our heads, and he said, I thought I was going to die. And Zip, who was he was a 16-year-old who was paid to be the third engineer. He was up on deck raising the anchor chain so that a boat didn't run into us, and they shot right over his head. He said, I felt it go past my hair. And then my best friend Kim was up on the bridge with the captain, and she said, yeah, I saw it all. And they never told any of us. And the rest of us didn't know. But that's when the captain said, I've got to get these kids out of here. This is really dangerous. So that was one of the astounding moments of, oh my God, if I hadn't asked, I never would have found out. And also we were putting together the pieces of what exactly happened. So the owners of the ship, after all this money had been put into the ship that they had leased to the school, they decided to go ahead to Panama and bribe officials and get us kicked off so they could get the ship back and have a working ship and be rid of us. But we never exactly figured out and put together how we got out of there. And we had the thought, Mary Tyler Moore's son, Mary Tyler Moore, the actress, her son Richie was one of the students on the ship. He was 14, he was the youngest. And we thought somehow Mary Tyler Moore had gotten us out. And we had some really rich kids, and we thought maybe they had gotten us out. And the director of the school had spent $6,000 in phone calls, calling back to the States, calling people to try to have people call. But when I was calling up and interviewing different people who had been on the ship, there were two First Nation young men from Alberta, Canada, who had grown up on a native reserve. And one of them I was able to reach, and we talked for about an hour and a half, and I just wrote like crazy. He said, oh, do you know how we got out of Panama? I said, no, how did we get out of Panama? He said he didn't find out until he left the ship, and he called his sister, and his sister worked in Ottawa with the chiefs of all the nations of the First Nations in Canada. And he said, what you need to know in Canada is the First Nations are not Canadian citizens. They are subject to the crown of the Queen. And he said, so the chiefs called the prime minister, they called the Queen, and supposedly the Queen called Nixon. And Nixon said, these are just kids, let them go. And that supposedly is how we got out of Panama.
Wow. Wow.
Because it was during the Panama Canal negotiations, and the American embassy was not answering calls from Americans in trouble, and the jail, our director of our school and her assistant were put in jail overnight. And there were all these Americans who had been driving through in VW buses, or Americans on little sailboats, and they had been put in jail, and the United States embassy wasn't answering calls. So when we actually left with our gear, the Panamanian said we were very lucky and very fortunate that we got out. So in a way, it was like realizing how serious it was, more serious it was at the time than I had realized. So that was one of the shocking things that we discovered in the process of unearthing memories.
I also wanted to ask you, of course, the ship experience changed you.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you were not a wild girl, that you were flexible, you wouldn't dance in the rain. I know that the experience changed you, but now some 50 years later, do you hold on to some of your pre-ship characteristics?
Yeah, I'm still a nerdy reading and writing girl, but I was always been that. But the ship really brought me alive in ways that I hadn't been before. And my friend Kim also really brought me alive. And I was my dad was bipolar, brilliant bipolar, and abusive. And I got strong enough from being on the ship to break away from the hold that my dad had on me. And I finally was able to break free and leave home. And I felt like, and I became a writer that year, and I learned what it really was to think, read and write and really think as a writer. And I've been writing ever since. And oh, Mary had asked, why did it take so long to write the book? Because I came home from the ship. I had my journals. I had all these photographs. I made this big photo album that my brother and I would trade back and forth for years. And I carried the journals with me everywhere. But by the 80s, late 80s or mid 80s, I was meditating, and there was a meditation teacher who said, what are you most attached to? You need to let go of attachments and lighten up your life so you can free up to live your life. So I burned my journals
Oh, no.
from the ship. But fortunately, so what I was working on when I was writing was from memory, and my friend Kim's journals, but I also had my letters home and the photographs and everyone else's photographs. But I feel like it released me from all of that sort of hypersense awareness of sort of what it took to emerge from my family system.
And did they let you go? Did you?
Yeah. Yeah, my dad had a manic episode, which was at a really good time. And he gave me his car that I could sell. And I sold his car, and that gave me the money to go to France for the next year. And then I started college after that, and I left home. I broke away. And the book Implosion is about my relationship with my dad, who I just absolutely adored. And I learned all about modern architecture and sculpture from him. And I was sort of caught between adoring him and breaking away and hating him. And it took until he died to sort of fully come to grips with and heal my relationship with him. And then writing the book about growing up as his daughter really helped me finalize and heal and release myself from him. And I've been an acupuncturist for 40 years. And one of the things I do is help revive people's spirits and help people heal. And that also has been an important part of my healing journey for myself as well.
So that brings the question, what brought you to Maine and what got you into acupuncture?
Good question. I was living in California, and this friend of mine from Maine was coming out there to observe with different practitioners. And I remember asking her about acupuncture, and I thought it sounded really weird. And she told me about it. And this friend of mine went to acupuncture, and I could really see him change. So I went to acupuncture, and in 2 months, it brought me out of a 7-year depression. And I thought, this is the most amazing thing I've ever experienced. I want to see if I can do it. And I went back to school and started pre-med classes and did my training. And then I was like, where do I want to go? Where is it legal? Because this was in 82, and it was only legal in a few states on the coasts. So I came to Maine and drove around the state and decided I was moving to Belfast, and I've been here ever since.
That's wonderful. I've read the book, and all of you should read it too. And one of the good part, there are many good parts. It is a page turner. I love the descriptions of your relationship with Kim. There were only 6 girls on the boat, and Kim was so different from you. The two of you managed to make a relationship and help each other out.
Yeah, Kim was the ultimate wild girl. There's a picture in the book of her in a bikini, and I'm in long sleeves and long pants, and I'm writing in my journal, and she's just totally out there. And it was sort of like that.
what I didn't realize was how much that we balanced each other and that we learned from each other and healed from each other. And we're still, and she became she moved to Italy. She became a fashion model. Oh, she first, after she left the ship, ended up installing diesel engines onto sailing ships. And then she became a model. Then she lived in Italy. She raised her kids there. Now she lives in England and is a therapist. And when we got into COVID, and I thought, when none of us knew who was going to live or die, and I was thought, who was it most important to talk to and to sort of reconnect and sort of really sort of reestablish our friendship, was Kim. So she and I talked for hours. Also my friend Alvin. It was just a really important time to connect with who are essential friends in life.
Mm-hmm. Let me see. You write poetry too. You have 3 books of poetry out. And how is that different from writing memoir?
I
Fit it in?
started,
When do
yeah,
you
I
write
started
poetry?
writing poetry right after I started getting acupuncture. It was like it freed up my creativity and I started writing poetry. So I wrote poetry off and on from my 20s into my 50s. And I was the poet laureate of Belfast. I was so identified with being a poet. But then I went to grad school at Stone Coast at University of Southern Maine, and started hearing people writing fiction, people writing nonfiction, people writing memoir, and there are a lot of poets who slowly work their way towards nonfiction and towards memoir. And I realized a lot of poetry is about writing intense moments of being. And as I was writing more, and in grad school, they were really pushing, write the deeper stories, the harder stories, the mortifying stories. As I got more into that, it was like the story that I was thinking about writing was getting bigger and bigger, and it was bigger than poetry could contain. And I started writing a lot of these childhood stories in poetry. And then ironically, I had heart surgery. I had an ablation to correct atrial fibrillation. And the strangest thing happened is, one of my fears of that surgery was I was going to lose poetry. And I did. I stopped. I haven't really written poetry since. But while I was healing and recovering, I started having vivid memories of first, like, being 7 and walking through my little village to the library, or driving with my dad with the top down in the snow and looking up in the trees. And I just started remembering. It was like every day there were these vivid memories, and it felt like they were releasing from my heart. And they moved from being young childhood up into my teens, into my 20s. And for the next year, I wrote pages a day. And I felt like I wrote out all the memories I had that were just lodged in me that I needed to release. And here I was signed up to be a poet and in grad school for a poet. And I remember telling my mentor, I don't know what's happening. He said, I think you're writing memoir. I went, memoir? I don't, I have to relearn how to write prose. So I added another semester, but I switched to creative nonfiction and realized I was writing a memoir. And that memoir took 10 years because I had to learn how to write prose. But one of my writing teachers said, your poetry is alive and well in your prose. I have a lyrical style.
I would,
But
I,
go ahead.
so are you still writing? Are you in a critique group? What people always want to know what your writing schedule is when you're an author.
Right. I think about writing all the time. I'm working on a new project that's about my grandmother, and I'm letting myself freeform I'm doing a lot of research because the span of her life is a really wide. Her father was one of the leaders in the American arts and crafts movement at the turn of the century. And so I've gone back to where she lived and where she had a farm and where she lived in the village that I grew up, and going to houses where she lived. And it's totally different than going inside my own experience and remembering something. I'm going into and imagining her experience, and I have stacks of old letters, old photographs, books, and so I'm just totally letting myself explore and figuring out what my voice is, what the style is. I'm thinking of third person. So I experiment, I try different styles. I gather lots of stories. Fortunately, my mom is still alive and she's 94, and I ask her tons of questions. And because I've been asking specific questions, I'm hearing all these stories I hadn't heard before. So I have stacks of stories from her. So I'm just deep diving into this new territory.
Exciting.
It
And
is.
now you have to tell everybody about writer and editor Tanya Whitten, is
Whiten.
adapting.
So
Go ahead.
so Tanya is a writer and editor and teacher in Portland. And some of you, if any of you are on the main Writers and Publishers newsletter that comes out every week, she sometimes teaches classes for main Writers and Publishers. So I worked with her as an editor on this book, on Sailing at the Edge of Disaster. And I remember going over her comments. She was going, "You what? That happened? That's so shocking. Oh, that's so inappropriate." She went, "Your teacher is giving feedback on sexual dreams. Really inappropriate." Like, yeah, it was the 70s. There were things, and then your parents didn't know. It was so cute to see what a 40-year-old or thought of the things in my book. But anyway, afterwards, she had this goal of, she had written a screenplay for a documentary, and she had this vision of writing screenplays and helping create movies of girls in adventurous situations. And she, after finishing working with my book, she came back to me and said, "I'd really like to work with you on this and to create a screenplay and for a film." And then we got feedback that we should work as a streaming series to have enough space rather than trying to squeeze it into a movie. So she's been working on this almost 2 years on working out, a streaming series, 8 episodes, and working on the script for the first episode and how you put together a selling pitch packet. And she's been taking classes with people in LA on how to do that and food connections. So I realized I didn't want to write a screenplay. I wanted to get on to my next project. So it's in her hands, and everyone always says if they read this, they go, "This should be a movie. It's so vivid."
Yeah.
So fingers crossed.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to hear from our audience. How did you choose Toad Hall as a publisher, and tell us about Toad Hall?
So Toad Hall Editions is this wonderful small press. It's 3 women. They had all moved to Maine right before COVID. And then in lockdown, they went, "What are we going to do?" And they decided to start a press. And if you look up Toad Hall Editions, they got to work. They've been publishing books. They've been publishing journals. They've been putting out calls for a young people's journal. They have topics. They've been just doing a lot of great stuff. So I had gotten to know them when they first moved to, they're in Northport, just down the road, and I had taken some books to them. And so when I was finishing this up and I was trying to find an agent, and I was looking at all the options for publishing, and as you know, publishing is just quite a world to try to get into. And I spent a year trying to find an agent and trying to find a publisher. And at the end of that year, and the pandemic was still going on, I thought, all right, I'm going to stay close to home. I'm going to stay in Maine rather than with Implosion. I had a book release in New York and in Boston. I did 2 trips to Cincinnati and did 6 different talks there. And I did a lot of really putting myself out. And I thought, this is a whole different thing, putting out a book during and after, the straining of after COVID. So I thought, so I pitched to them. I gave them, they got, I think, the 10th, 11th, and 12th manuscript. One of them read each one of them, and then they asked to meet with me, and they said, "We love your book. We want to do it." And I felt so fortunate because they It's a beautiful book. It's beautifully designed. They put so much thought and effort into it, and I couldn't be happier with this, that this story got put into such a beautiful container. And it was a blast bringing the book out, and I did talks around Maine, and then I did a lot of talks that were then on Zoom. So what was great is some of the early Zoom talks, a lot of my classmates from the ship were on the Zoom talks. So it was so sweet. Someone from China and someone in England and someone in Denmark and all over the United States and in Costa Rica were all on these calls. I also had a video or a filmmaker make a small book, a book trailer. And so we made a Zoom call with Pogo from China, Kim in England, Zip in Costa Rica, my brother in New Hampshire, me here. And then we were all on a call all at the same time. And the filmmaker recorded us answering questions and telling stories. And it was so much fun. And he put those voices into the little video. If you go to my website, elizabethgarber.com, you can see the video and you see more pictures of the ship and hear more voices from kids on the ship.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions like about the ship? And since I know nothing about ships or sailing, but I was interested, you were splicing the ropes and I mean, those kind of details. Does anyone have any questions?
Elizabeth?
Hi, I have a question, not so much about that, but I put it in the chat, but I'm curious what your family was doing during this whole adventure of you. They have their daughter and son on this boat, you know, you're held hostage. Was there, how did they feel about it? And did they, especially your father, how did he kind of come to terms with this decision to send you off? Or did he think, hey, this is great, you know, they're going to get some backbone after being taken hostage?
We were in Panama with there were no phones, I think she was only calling the wealthy families. I don't think she called all the families. I remember asking my mom recently, oh, that must have been so upsetting hearing when the director finally wrote a letter and sent it out to the parents after we were out of Panama, telling what had happened. She said, oh, I was so busy with school, I didn't really pay attention to what was going on. I was like, oh, we were really out there. And my father thought all these things that happened on the ship were great. And he came down and helped on the ship for a number of weeks before we set sail. Part of 70s parenting was a lot of negligence. And a lot of people had no idea what was going on until we got home. Also, you think we were held hostage for 2 weeks. There were armed gunboats. You know, now if kids would come home, they would be put in therapy. They would be dealing with trauma. No, it was like, go back straight to life. No, hardly anyone even mentioned it or brought it up or saw it as a problem. It was like on to the next thing. It was only as an adult realizing we went through a really intense thing. We were down to we were out of water. They were pulling the liquor out of the liquor cabinet so we'd have some liquid to drink. They were using the last cans in the pantry. And we were just sort of flowing with it, thinking that it was going to work out somehow. But as an adult later going, it was really rough what we went through.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary. Wouldn't really happen in 2024, I guess.
No. And you're not something like that. The whole world would know what was happening. No one knew what was happening. And I think they made sure that what didn't go into newspapers, there was no coverage. There was no publicity. And if Mary Tyler Moore's son now were on a ship and it was held hostage, it was like the news would be all over it. We would be out in a day.
Yes. Huh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wild. Yeah. Barbara.
Wow.
Hi, I don't have a question, but I do want to say thank you so much for writing this. And I thought that I saw you also on the TV program 207. And
that was so much fun.
Yeah. Well, I just got a much better picture tonight with all that you've been able to talk, in a longer space of time. But,
Yeah,
I was thinking that adventure on the ship is only number one. It seems that you had another adventure writing about it, getting together with
yes,
all of your friends and seamates and everything. And now you're having another adventure in your writing career. And
yeah.
it's so much fun to listen to you because I think that you've just got a great slant on life, and it's just interesting to hear. So thank you for sharing everything with
Thank you
us
so
tonight.
much.
Anybody else? You don't want to hear about the engine room and how working and okay.
Working and what's so fun is there's the writing about it, there's the learning of it, and then every time I do a book talk like this, I get to remember the ship again. It gets to put me back there because I've been totally the last few weeks I've been in the 1930s in Glendale, Ohio, and then it's like, all right, I'm stepping back into the ship again. It's like each time you read a book, it comes alive again.
Mhm.
So each time I talk about it, it gets to come alive again. So it's a real treat for me as much as to share it with you, but also it refreshes and brings that world back up to me.
Mhm.
Do you know if there are any school? Oh, go ahead, Paula.
I was just wondering, this adventure that you had on the ship, do you feel as though this helped to help create who you are today? The experiences, do you unknowingly draw on those experiences that make you a stronger person or a more resilient person?
It made me a much more resilient person. And I think if I did, there's some key things in my life that have been life-changing. The ship, getting acupuncture. Without the ship, I think I would have stayed being sort of a depressive introvert, and sort of moody. If I hadn't gotten acupuncture, I think I would have been a depressive, moody introvert. So and then having remarkable friends that makes the difference of a lifetime. And when you go through such an intense experience, you become so bonded to those people. And there's also, it's like the people we're closest to in our late teens and early 20s, there's a way we're connect with them. We're so open and there's so much we need to learn, and they're so open that there's a way we make deeper friends than we do the rest of our lives, and that those friends are still so essential. And I'm so grateful for the friends I made on the ship.
So are you therefore grateful for that
I'm
experience?
grateful for the experience. I'm grateful to know that I can go through something really hard and get through it.
Mm.
And I'm grateful I learned how to climb the rigging. And by the end of the ship, I could climb the rigging up and over and do it on my own and not freeze up. And that there were a lot of things in life that I learned to not freeze up and get terrified. And it made me a much braver, adventurous person.
That's nice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you know if there are still schools for teenagers on ships?
There are a lot of sail training programs. A lot of different countries have built sail training ships in the last number of years. If you go online, it's remarkable. And they're now, they're really well run. They're safe. The ships meet modern sailing requirements. I did hear of a student on a sail training ship who died about a year ago, but there are hundreds of kids out there on sail training ships. And the sea is really dangerous and it's really intense to be on ships. But as my brother said, every troubled 14-year-old boy should be sent to sea, because you're up against something way tougher than your attitude and teachers at school. And he thinks it's just an essential way to grow up. And it felt like it was life-changing for him.
Hmm.
And what about your youngest brother?
I think he was fine that he didn't go to sea. He went off and he worked on oil rigs. That was his sort of big adventure. Yeah, so yeah, but he was envious of us. But then after hearing more of it, I think he felt like he had sort of dodged a bullet. But
but he had his own adventures. But it was fun to share the book with him. Yeah, Chris.
Had your father gone to sea himself, or was this his childhood
That was
dream
his
that he
dream.
was
My
living
father's,
through his children, or
yeah, my father's dream was always to go off and sail for a year and to sail on a big ship. And he announced to us after being on the ship 3 weeks that he was going to stay on the ship for the whole year. And my brother and I said, no, you're not. And he disowned us and said we could never come home again. That's a good scene in the book.
Yeah,
Um,
that is,
But
wow.
eventually he did, after he closed his architecture practice and he sold his house, he got on a ship. And the irony is the captain was crazy and cruel and dominating. And he was under the control of a crazy person. And then my father had a health issue and he was a really broken man by the time he got off the ship. But I
Oh.
feel like it was a karmic balancing.
Oh.
And my father and I had a really great time after I took care of him, and helped him get in stronger shape to be able to get home after he got off that ship.
Oh.
So it's a strange, I can't remember if I mentioned that a little bit at the end. Oh,
Mm.
it's in Implosion.
Oh, it's an implosion. Okay.
So he
Chris?
did, yeah, Chris.
I know you said this was kind of a collaborative thing when you were able to speak with a lot of your friends who were on the ship with you, but has anyone else contemplated doing a memoir of their time there? Or do you feel like, yeah, they kind of said, okay, it's done.
You did it, right? People sometimes think about writing a memoir is so much work, and you almost have to be driven and compelled, and but it was great sharing a lot of that experience with people. And then I'd have a new chapter and I'd send it in, and then I'd get feedback from them, but they were so appreciative that they got to relive the year on the ship in the process of me writing it and then reading it. And but Kim, actually, she and I had thought about creating a play or something with it, but nothing ever happened with it. And I just said, I'm writing a memoir. That's what I'm going to do.
Mm.
Do you
Yeah.
get to help pick out who's going to play you in the streaming series?
Oh, I've had a lot of fun, but I don't really know young actresses. So I started watching films looking at, oh, I think she would be really good. So Tanya and I have had sort of some fun, but it's so many years out. If it actually ever got picked up, it's years out. So we'll have to wait for some young actresses. My daughter and I used to joke years ago. She's now in her mid-30s, that we were going, oh, because she looks so much like me that we went, oh, she could play me. But she goes, no, I'm aged out. I could play Stephanie. And then no, I've aged out. I'm playing Stephanie. Stephanie was the director of the school, the 24-year-old. Yeah. But it's been fun.
Paula?
How did you feel when you had completed this memoir? Was it cathartic for you? Was it a big sigh of relief? What did you feel?
I felt so glad that I had, because I went over draft after, every chapter was probably 8 or 10 drafts, and the whole book was 12 drafts. And I had worked so hard, and it was like wrestling a puzzle of how to tell the story and how to put things in what order and what I would present and what I wouldn't present. And it was like having been inside an intense, what are those puzzles with all the colors, the cube, Rubik's Cube. It was like being inside this puzzle for 5 years of figuring out how to tell the story. And then it was like the final, like the 5th or 8th copy edit and sending it off to be published. It was just like, wow, I did it. I set out what I set out to do. I'm so happy with it. I love all the pictures that went in it. There's only one typo in the whole book that any of us have found. It was like, to have gotten it to that level of being finished felt so good. And then it was so exciting and so fun to bring it out. It was a really great accomplishment.
And how did you feel about telling your story? Was
felt
that
really
an
great.
emotional release or?
What's fun, it was just fun. Like talking about implosion, um, this is a really tough story. And it was really emotional bringing some parts of it out and having people respond, and a lot of people respond to that in my history. This was just a blast. It was just, a teenage adventure and all these friends, and especially after such a hard 10-year slog working on Implosion. I remember finishing Implosion going, okay, what's next? The ship or my grandmother? And I went, the ship. It's time
Wow.
for the ship.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Oh, well,
it's great questions. I'm really enjoying your questions.
oh,
All
there's
right.
Joe. You're mute.
Sort of a question and a comment. The 70s, there were a lot of schools that popped up where parents who recognized that their kids maybe were getting into drugs or going down the wrong path were
Yeah.
sent to kind of outrageous situations. There was a school in Maine that was like that many parents actually were brought by Children Protective Services for sending their kids to those schools. Was this boat sort of the same thing? Were people
Yeah.
sending kids to intervene in choices they were making in their life in the 70s?
Yeah, when the director was choosing who to bring on the ship, she was trying to balance of the kids who were totally out of control and needed to really shape up, and then the really good kids, and she was like trying to get the balance right, and then she felt like the really out of control kids sort of took over and were sort of taking the good kids down the path. But I felt like we got through it. And it ended up it being a really good experience for a lot of the kids. And there were some kids who were stoned or drinking a lot of the time.
It sounds like shades of Lord of the Flies.
Except that we did watch out for each other. Yeah, because people have asked that, and even though there was some sarcasm and there were, kids doing what they did to survive, that the officers watch out for us. The teachers were in their own realm a lot of the time, but the kids did watch out for each other. We like the night I got drunk for the first time in my life, first and only time in my life, my 15-year-old brother stayed up with me all night to make sure I was safe. That was remarkable. And that was sort of the kind of watching out, the druggy, smoking, drinking kids, they also watched out for each other. And we watched out for each other in the rigging. And yeah, even though it was crazy and dangerous, there was a lot of attention and caring for each other.
Okay, well, I see that it's 8 o'clock. And so I want to thank you, Elizabeth, for spending this time with us. And I want to encourage you to go to her website, elizabethgarber.com, and encourage you even more to get her book and read it, because then we can discuss it more.
Well, thanks so much for coming to this conversation. It was really fun. You asked great questions, and we all got to step into that wild world for an hour.
Yeah.
It's really fun.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, have a great rest of the winter. All right.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.